Thank you again to our co-sponsors. Now I'd like to introduce our first panel. It's going to be a good one. An interview of Neel Kashkari, President and CEO of the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. He'll be interviewed by my fellow board members, President Tina Danforth and Melanie Benjamin. The Federal Reserve Bank plays a pivotal role, especially in Indian country. So we're really excited to have Neel here to get to know him better and learn about efforts to support tribes and tribal economies. Please welcome Neel, Tina, and Melanie.
Nice to meet you. Good morning. Thank you for joining us. We appreciate it. Where do you like? In the middle?
In the middle?
Yeah.
Right there?
Okay. There you go.
Good morning.
Good morning and welcome to NAFOA. Thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
All right. We understand you're recently a new father. How is that working out for you? You getting some sleep?
It's working out great. So my wife and I had a child, a baby girl, in February. So she's 8 months now, and just a joy. So I couldn't be happier.
That's awesome. Yes. So we understand you have a lot of interesting backgrounds, and one of them is you're a rocket science public servant candidate for governor. And George Clooney even bought the rights of your story. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So I was born and raised in Ohio. My parents came to the U.S. from India about 50 years ago or so. I was kind of a normal kid. My parents really focused on education, and I studied engineering and then went into business and finance after I got more education. And I've done a lot of different things. And so I feel very lucky that every opportunity has been open to me, but it's been open to me because I got a good education. That's been the key, and for me, I think for so many of us. And I love working at the Federal Reserve because I love public policy. Okay. I always say to people, if you want to help 1,000 people, donate to a charity. If you want to help 100,000 or 1 million or 10 million, you can only do that through public policy by changing the system so that everybody has the capability of being lifted. And so that's what excites me about being at the Federal Reserve and being at this conference.
Okay, thank you.
Since you're in Indian country, my question is, how does Indian country factor into the Fed's mission? How has your work as a Federal Reserve Bank president changed your perspective on Indian country?
I'll say, so I've been at the Minneapolis Fed for 3.5 years, almost 4 years, and I honestly didn't know very much about Indian country until I joined the Minneapolis Fed. At the Minneapolis Fed, we have a very important research center called the Center for Indian Country Development, where we have dedicated researchers who are focused on economic development in Indian country. Now, what is our job at the Minneapolis Fed? There are 12 Federal Reserve Banks in the United States of America. We are the 9th Federal Reserve Bank. Okay. Our job is to represent our region. That's Minnesota, North and South Dakota, Montana, part of Michigan, and part of Wisconsin. Indian country is a big role in the region that we represent. So a big part of our jobs are to promote economic development in Indian country, but also to understand what's happening in our region. I go back to Washington, D.C. every 6 weeks where we set interest rates for the United States, and I speak about what's happening in our region. And so Indian country is an important part of America, and it's a very large part of my Federal Reserve District. So it's part of our jobs to know what's happening in Indian country and to bring that perspective back to Washington.
So as you engage in Indian country, do you have any strategies going forward, or has any of your strategies changed? I know you said you've only been there about 3 years, but has anything changed since the time you started to now, and going forward, how would you commit to continuing engagement with Indian country?
Well, I think our commitment is only getting stronger. We've been very focused on a few areas, which I think are the right areas. We've been very focused on housing and home ownership and enabling tribal members to be able to buy a home on reservation, which has so many challenges that we're aware of. We published a book this year on zeroing in on what those challenges are and how to navigate them. And we've been very focused on education. I mean, every person that I meet, we have a Native American member of our board of directors, David Emery, from South Dakota. Every successful person I've met in Indian country or outside of Indian country, education has been a key to that success. So we've done a lot of research at the Minneapolis Fed on education, on early education. That research is very applicable to Indian country, and we want to continue to do everything we can to give young Indians a good education so that they can get good jobs, so that they can start businesses, and that they can have a life of success.
Okay, I would agree that education is a key to success for almost anybody. And so as you continue to educate people and do your research, what are some of the primary top things that you think is important?
Well, one of the top things that the Minneapolis Fed has worked on for many, many years before I joined is the focus on early education, that you have to get to children early, very early. And we're not just talking about pre-kindergarten. I mean, now that I'm a father, it's much more personal for me. But if you look at the research on how children's brains develop, it's from birth. I mean, literally there's research that shows that some kids have parents who talk to them continuously when they're little infants. Other children don't. And those whose parents talk to them continuously, their brains are more wired to learn, and that they develop language skills earlier. And so, I mean, my wife teases me because I am just constantly peppering my daughter with random little conversations about anything. Sometimes she gets tired, and I can tell when she gets tired, and then I need to put her to sleep. But it's little lessons like that. That doesn't cost any money. It doesn't cost any money to talk to your infant. And yet, if we can get the message out that simply conversing with your infant is a key to putting them on a track of future success, if we teach everybody that, that's great, that everybody can do that for their own children. And so there are little things like that that actually don't cost any money that could be very, very powerful.
That's one of the things I think about as well, too, is over the years of my journey into the different institutes of education, that they always talked about education starts to cure the ills. And when we look at Minnesota and we look at our data, that there's a lot of negative data that pertains to Indian country. So when you talk about pursuing education and how that benefits all, I think that's a very good position to be in. So I have a question shifting a little bit to, given the recent manufacturing and service data that clearly indicates a slowing economy, what are your thoughts on how aggressive the Fed should be in cutting the rates? And how will you approach your role next year on the committee?
So I've been pretty outspoken in the 3.5 years I've been at the Fed, arguing against raising interest rates. Let me go back. We have what's called a dual mandate. We have two goals. Okay. One goal is maximum employment, as many people as possible are able to find jobs. Another goal is stable prices. Think of an economy that's not overheating and not growing too slowly. And these things we think are linked through the job market. As the economy gets tight, people find jobs, businesses have to compete to retain their workers, they have to pay more, and that leads to prices going up. So it's a little bit like a seesaw. Well, for the last 3 years or so, inflation has been low, so it's not overheating, and we keep being surprised more people are taking jobs. So now the national unemployment rate is 3.5%. That's very low on history. But as you probably know, that unemployment rate only counts people who are actively looking for work. Turns out a lot of people gave up. And so how many more people are out there? So as the economy appears to be showing more risks, business investment is slowing, the global economy is slowing, and inflation continues to come in below our target, my message is clear. We should be supporting the economy, not tapping the brakes on the economy. So I want to look at the data, how it evolves over the next few months. But so far, I'm happy that we're cutting interest rates. I don't think we should have been raising them. How much more do we have to cut? I don't know yet.
Okay. Thank you for the explanation.
Sure.
Jobs, of course, are important, especially in Indian country, because not only education will help our economies, but so do jobs. So they go hand in hand. So thank you for that explanation on the importance of how that balance occurs. Recently, you supported the carbon tax, but you also said climate change needs better solutions. And in your estimation, what are some of those solutions?
Well, I consider myself a person of science. So if the best scientists in the world are telling us climate change is a serious issue, I take that very seriously. The challenge is we need to get the whole world to move. And if it's just the US acting unilaterally, the question is, will that be enough of an impact to slow down CO2 emissions, as an example? So as I've looked at it, it seems to me that technology has to play a very important role here. How do we develop new technologies that are both cleaner and cheaper so that countries all around the world can adopt them? If we just impose a very expensive solution on America, but the rest of the world says, no, we're not going to impose this expensive solution and slow our own economic growth down, then that doesn't actually solve the problem. So for me, I think we need to focus on public policies that focus on technology development. So the advantage of a carbon tax, as an example, is not so much that it'll reduce emissions directly. In my opinion, the carbon tax will send an incentive to private sector researchers to go develop new technologies to try to make things cleaner and cheaper. And if there are breakthroughs, then we can sell those technologies all around the world, and people around the world will adopt them. So from my perspective, it's really about technology development as the best way to solve this.
I agree technology is important, but globally, I think there's only so much we can do to encourage cleaner air. But I still believe, like locally, we have to do our part, regardless of what the rest of the world is doing. We have to be in the forefront of that. And so if we can find ways that technology will help assert things in the industry and manufacturing, we need to really push that and pursue that. So I agree, but I think it's just really important that we take care of the air.
Well, so I agree with you, but the slight subtlety that I'll say is, if we just do something locally, but it doesn't help people around the world to adopt it, then that may not be enough. So whatever we do locally, if we can do it in a way that we can also export around the world, then that makes it more likely that we're going to be able to arrest this crisis, because we probably can't do it by ourselves.
That's true.
I don't think we're in
very
disagreement.
True. Right, okay, thank you.
Is it time for a question from the audience before
Sure.
we continue?
Are there any questions so far? We covered a few minor topics, but we do have more questions up here, so if anyone wants to take an opportunity, we have a couple questions over here. There are some mic runners on the floor.
Hi there. You were talking a little bit about interest rates and the level they're at right now. Maybe is it appropriate to continue to lower interest rates? But what is your feeling or thought or fear as to whether or not a recession comes? Because we might be closer to a recession than, or closer to the end of this economic cycle than not. But so if the Fed funds rate ends up at 1 or 1.25 and we enter a recession, whether it's severe or not, what happens from there? And is quantitative easing and just more of that and adding to the size of the balance sheet of the Fed, is that a very easy and relevant option to swallow at this point?
So this is a common question, which is interest rates are fairly low relative to history. And so in prior recessions, the Federal Reserve would typically cut interest rates by 4 or 5 percentage points. And now interest rates are much lower, so some people are worried we won't be able to cut his rates as far if another recession comes. And that's where, as you said in the question, we do have these other tools, such as quantitative easing, that are not perfect substitutes for moving the federal funds rate up and down, but can be very powerful in providing stimulus to the economy. So I think we ought to do what we think is right for the economy today. And if nonetheless a recession comes at some point in the future, we can lean on these other tools. These tools were untested in 2008 and 2009 when they were first deployed. I think we have a lot more experience with them. And some of the risks of these tools, that they would lead to runaway inflation or they would devalue the dollar, they didn't come true at all. So I feel like we have more confidence now that if we needed to use them, we would be able to use them maybe even more powerfully than we did in the past. But I don't think we should keep rates artificially high now, because that'll make it more likely we enter the recession. I'd rather try to avoid the recession if we can.
Good question. We have another one over here to my left. And then we have some way in the back.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Long-term interest rates, as you said, have been fairly low for a long period of time. So we're in this
Could you speak
historical.
closer to the mic, please? Thank you.
We're in this historical low interest environment for some time. Some obligations are counting on investment returns that are higher. How long do you think this low interest environment will continue?
So this is a big question mark that we're all facing in the economics field and in policymaking around the world. If you look around the world in advanced economies, interest rates have been gradually falling for 30 or 40 years. What central banks do, so this is the trend of interest rates. Central banks are moving interest rates up and down around this global trend to try to either slow down the economy or stimulate the economy. But we don't actually set this trend. This trend is what we call the neutral interest rate, the interest rate that neither stimulates nor restrains the economy. The trend is set by broader forces like demographics, like global savings, like technology development. So when are interest rates globally going to go up again? I don't know. One of the theories that explains why interest rates are so low is that many societies around the world are aging. Older people tend to save more money and spend less money, combined with the fact that there's not big demand for investment right now. So you have, in a sense, an excess of savings relative to investment, which leads to interest rates being low. The biggest destination for capital, the biggest demand for capital, investment capital in the last decade in America has been in the oil fields because of fracking in North Dakota, in Oklahoma, in Texas. A lot of capital was drawn in there. Where are the other big demands for capital? If you think about other innovations in America recently, Twitter and Facebook, these don't require much capital. And so it's a long answer to your question. When are interest rates going to go back up? When there are big new demands for capital for profitable investment. I don't know what those are going to be, but when that happens, that would be when I would expect interest rates globally to go back up.
Thank you for that response. There is a question in the back of the room. Could you just state your name?
Oh, sure. It's Sorna. I'm with Scotts Valley Band of Pomo Indians out of Lake County, California. And I was interested in knowing, you mentioned that there was a book that you published on how to handle individual financing for housing for Indian country. I'm wondering, it's a two-part question. One is, where would someone find that? And the second is, what other books might there be available along those lines or other lines that might interest us?
So I'm sorry, could you repeat, what was the first question? I didn't hear you.
Where would we locate that publication?
Oh, where would you locate the publication? It's on our website, certainly, minneapolisfed.org. We have a Center for Indian Country Development webpage there. There'll be a link there, and I imagine we can send it to you. We have hard copies printed. Do we have any hard copies with us now? We don't have hard copies with us now, but if you come up here to the front, some of my colleagues are here. Jim is raising his hand. Get your card. We'll mail you a copy. But if you don't come to us physically, minneapolisfed.org, Center for Indian Country Development, that's our repository, not only of that work, but other research that we're doing continuously. It's all housed there. So as an example, I'm looking at one of our economists, Donna here, just published a paper on the cost of mortgages on reservation versus off reservation and what some of the differences are there. So there's a lot of research that's ongoing, housing-related research, education-related research. It's all on our website, minneapolisfed.org, and just look for the Center for Indian Country Development. Thank you for your question.
As a follow-up, has there been a difference in the cost for interest rates, whether a property is on tribal lands, for example, trust, or there's other statuses of land? Does that have an impact on the cost of financing?
I'm certain that it does. In fact, Donna's new research paper specifically just focuses in on that. I don't know off the top of my head the difference between trust and other land statuses. Donna might, but her new research paper literally focuses on the differences in mortgage costs on reservation versus off, and there's a significant difference. It's significantly higher, and the question is, why is it higher? Some of it's related to manufactured homes versus stick-built homes, but I think there are other factors, and access to credit is certainly part of it.
Okay. There's another question.
Yeah, back there.
He has the mic over there.
Is Jerry?
Hi, Jack.
Oh,
hi,
sorry.
hello.
Can't see the podiums in the way.
There you are.
Behind the podium. Hi, my name is Jackson, and I'm originally from the Navajo Nation, and I'm glad you mentioned the dual mandate. The place where I'm from, the official unemployment is about 20%, and the underemployed rate is closer to 45%. And that's much more significant than the 3.5% we're talking about already. And I'm glad that the Minneapolis Fed has the Center for Indian Country Development. But in a society where Native Americans make up about 1.5% of the nation, but we are heavily loaded with much higher unemployment rate, so we are really the tail of the unemployment rate. Wouldn't it make sense if we have a dual mandate to focus on that tail instead of using really a broad hammer, the interest rate? Shouldn't we invest in more things like the Center for Indian Country Development, and shouldn't other Federal Reserve banks do that?
Thanks for your question. So I'm very, very focused on the issue you're raising. I'll give you, and this is a question I've been asking in recent tribal meetings I've been doing. As the U.S. economy has gotten stronger, and as the national labor market has gotten tighter, traditionally we would have expected inflation to be taking off, but it has not been taking off, I think because businesses have been bringing workers in from the sidelines who normally they didn't give much of a chance to. I'll give you an example. There are many stories of businesses saying, historically, they would not give somebody with a criminal record a chance, and now they are. Or somebody who didn't have the training to work a machine. Now businesses are saying, well, I can't find somebody who already knows how to use the machine, so I will train you to use the machine. These are wonderful anecdotes of businesses giving people a chance. The question that I've been asking is this extending into Indian country? So I'll give you, nationally, African American unemployment is almost always twice white unemployment. So if it's a good economy and white unemployment is 5%, typically African American unemployment will be 10. If it's a recession and white unemployment is 8, African American unemployment is 16. But now, as the labor market is getting tighter, you're starting to see some of that gap closing. So that's really good news. The question is it extending to Indian country? Are Native Americans finally getting a chance to become members of the labor force in and around their reservations? So far, what I've been hearing is not really. Now, I hope I hope it is true that they're getting a chance. So far, I'm hearing the answer is not really. So for me, we need to focus on understanding what are those barriers. Why is it that many businesses say we can't find workers, and yet you go to reservations and there's very high unemployment, like you just said? Is it a transportation barrier? What are the barriers to bringing people to those jobs? Now, in terms of monetary policy, we cannot target one interest rate for one sector of the country or one tribe or one reservation or one state. We all use the same dollar, so it's one interest rate for the whole country. So the Federal Reserve has to set interest rates based on those national averages. We can't target different folks. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't do more research to understand what are the barriers for people benefiting from that strong economy. And that's why we have the Center for Indian Country Development. But let me just say, the Center for Indian Country Development is not only focused on our region. We view it as a national center doing research on national issues facing tribes all across the country.
Thanks.
Thank you for your question.
We have Jerry in the back.
Hi, I'm Jerry Hinkey from the Muckleshoot Indian Tribe, Chief Investment Officer, enrolled Macaw member. Question is on the overnight repurchase agreements. There's been some transactions by the New York Fed over the past few weeks. And last year, at the end of, in December, there were some issues with liquidity in the levered loan markets. What steps are the Feds taking to make sure there's plenty of liquidity in the system, and are they going to have to expand the balance sheet compared to contracting it over the last 18 months?
Thank you for your question. So let me separate two different things. One thing is when we set monetary policy to try to either boost or restrain the economy. Then the second issue, which was related, is how that monetary policy is implemented. Once the committee, the Federal Open Market Committee, makes a decision, how does that decision then get spread out across the economy through financial markets? And the gentleman asked a question in September. Some of those financial markets, we call them money markets, short-term interest rate markets, showed signs of stress, where the committee said we want interest rates to be low, but then despite our declaration, interest rates in some of these markets spiked. And at that point, the New York Fed stepped in with some interventions to try to make sure there was enough liquidity in the system so that the policy stance that the committee has decided upon was transmitted effectively into the markets and into the economy. And I think that the New York Fed and the Federal Reserve will continue to take appropriate action to make sure that whatever policy the committee chooses is effectively spread out into money markets and across the financial system, including at quarter end and including at year end. So will they need to do more at year end? I don't know, but I'm confident that my colleagues at the New York Fed will take the appropriate measures so that policy is actually transmitted appropriately into these markets.
Okay, I have Dawson on my right, and then I have a gentleman up here in the front.
Neel, thank you for joining us today, and I just want to acknowledge the work that Patrice and her team and the Center for Indian Country Development are doing. I think it's incredible, and I think we all appreciate the research that they're doing, so thank you for supporting their efforts. I think one way to...
Can you speak a little closer to the mic?
Yeah, I think one way to inform and give some perspective on the issues impacting Indian country is to, add tribal leaders to kind of the table at the Minneapolis Fed. Tribal governments and tribally owned enterprises are large employers in your district, particularly in rural areas. They're investing in a lot of infrastructure. Tribal operations are impacted sometimes by weather, right? And I think, gaming is also kind of a function of consumer spending, right? So I think tribal leaders and tribal representatives on the Minneapolis Fed board could add a lot to kind of what's going on in your country. I understand there's a tribal leader, a tribal member on the Helena board, but I think adding or considering somebody for the Minneapolis board would be helpful.
So as I mentioned, so we both have tribal members on our Helena board, and David Emery from South Dakota is an enrolled member of his tribe, is on our main board of directors in Minneapolis. He's also the CEO of a power company, and so he wears two hats. He's bringing a tribal perspective, but also a big business perspective. And then for our Indian Country Center, we also have an advisory board of tribal experts and members that are advising our research on Center for Indian Country Development. And let me just add, when I go out across the district, I'll very often have meetings with tribal leaders. So I was just in Montana. We had a meeting of the major tribes in Montana, invited me in with some of my team to meet with them to hear directly from them. So I'm not pushing back at all. I agree 100% with what you're saying, and we agree with you, and we're doing everything we can to do exactly what you're saying. Thank you.
Thank you for that explanation, and I agree, there needs to be more engagement and more collaboration with tribal leadership and tribal business people. Doesn't necessarily have to be the leadership, but there are a lot of tribal corporations and financial institutions that have tribal people, so if you could extend it to that degree as well, that would be helpful. So we're running out of time, so this next question will be our last question. So, sir?
Mac McReynolds with Multi-Bank. I wanted to ask
Can you speak closer?
Mac McReynolds with Multi-Bank. I wanted to ask you about the secured overnight financing rate. What are your thoughts of that?
I'm sorry, I didn't follow the question. Say it one more time.
Mac McReynolds with Multi-Bank Securities, and I wanted to ask about the secured overnight financing rate. I'm sorry. Thank you.
Yes. So the alternative to LIBOR that you're talking about?
Yes.
Yes. So the New York Fed and our colleagues around the system are looking at an alternative. LIBOR is an interest rate that banks charge each other. The London Interbank Offered Rate that during the financial crisis showed that it had some big flaws in it, subject to potential manipulation. So there's this secure overnight financing rate, SOFR, that's been proposed as a potential alternative to LIBOR that showed a big spike in recent months. The gentleman in the back asked a question about interest rates spiking a few weeks ago. So they spiked in SOFR. So this is an area where not only do we want to make sure that interest rates are reflecting the monetary policy that the committee sets, but that big banks have experience using these different rates and pricing different securities off of these rates, et cetera. So I think this is an area that people are still learning a lot more about, but it's something that we want to make sure serves the job that it's supposed to serve and is not subject to manipulation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for your insight. Again, I think it's real important that you continue the research and the impacts on Indian country. And I know you talked about the spikes and wanting to control them, but I think that's also real important because as you mentioned earlier in the conversation is that you know, mortgage rates tend to be higher and financing fees are higher when going into Indian country, and we would really like for you to try and target some of those things to help alleviate that on our tribal communities. That would be fantastic if you could pay attention to that more.
Absolutely.
So thank you for your time. We really appreciate that you're here. Thank you, Melanie, for your
Thank
help
you.
here. And hope
Thank
to
you
see
for
you
having
back
me.
sometime.
For
okay?
sure. I
All right,
really
thank
appreciate
you.
it. Thank
All
you.
right, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Good.
Appreciate it.
Thank you. All right, we have a safe trip.